Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm John King. Thank you for sharing your day with us. California in flames. At least 31 have died as fires ravage both northern and southern areas of the state. We'll have live updates on what the governor calls the new abnormal. Plus, the president is out of the public eye today, but tweeting rave reviews of his weekend trip to France. He skipped an event honoring America's World War I heroes and was lectured by the French president about nationalism. And it's recount week in Florida, and it opens with a nasty tone. 3 statewide races are impacted. The Senate result will shape the balance of power here in the new Congress.
We want free and fair elections. We want people to participate, but we don't want any fraud. We need to know exactly what happened here.
There is no evidence of fraud. Here's what there is evidence of. There is evidence of 8 years of Rick Scott as the governor of Florida trying to manipulate the outcome of elections.
And we begin there with the Florida recounts and the president's call to stop everything, he says. Go back to the election night count. This from the presidential Twitter account, 7:40 a.m. here in the East. New ballots showed up out of nowhere, and many ballots are missing or forged. An honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected must go with election night. That's what the president of the United States says. Florida election monitors, actually there, say they have zero evidence of fraud. Quote, our staff has not seen any evidence of criminal activity, the Florida Secretary of State's office said yesterday and reiterated again today. Since Tuesday, Republicans have complained some key county election officials are, in their words, flouting the law. They say missing reporting deadlines. Those Republicans have sued repeatedly to enforce the rules. Now, the Republican president wants to put the law aside, skip the recount. Those recounts underway right now in the contest for Senate, governor, and state agriculture commissioner. The first deadline to finish a machine recount is Thursday. The Palm Beach County election supervisor, though, says her count won't be finished by then. She says that's impossible. Another legal complication today, the Republican Senate candidate, that's the state's governor, Rick Scott, in court after asking state police to impound voting machines and ballots when not in use. He says the process can't be trusted.
We know that our laws are set up to prevent fraud. Okay, we know that they didn't let in party officials to observe. We know that there was no transparency. They're supposed to tell us where all this was coming from, when, how many ballots, all these things. We know mysteriously 93,000 new ballots showed up after Election Day. We know that Brenda Snipes has said that she took illegal ballots and put them in with legal ballots. She admitted that. We know that they continued to try to count after the deadline.
CNN's Ryan Noble's on the ground for us in Tallahassee. Ryan, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of spin. What are the facts?
Well, John, when you take a look at the fact that we have 8.5 million votes cast in the state of Florida, and there are 67 counties that are now undergoing this massive recount, there's a lot to unpack here in the Sunshine State. When the president talks about no need for a recount, that simply flies in the face of the reality of Florida law. It is an automatic recount if this vote is within half a percentage point, and that is the case with these 3 big races. But even though those margins are tight, infinitesimally small in the context of 8.5 million votes, it is still a relatively wide margin in terms of what it takes to win in a recount. Even the Senate race, with 12,000 votes between the Republican governor, Rick Scott, against the incumbent Senator Bill Nelson, 12,000 votes is a lot to overcome in a recount. In fact, there's no example, no precedent of that ever happening in American politics. The closest example would be the Washington governor's race, and that was around 2,000 votes. So both Republicans and Democrats are pretty clear-eyed about what is at stake here. Everyone believes the recount should go forward, but there aren't too many people that you can find that genuinely believe that at the end of this recount, we're going to see a different thing than what we saw on election night, at least in the Senate and governor's race. Yet Democrats are convinced the recount must go forward because every voice should be heard, every vote should be counted, and those results should reflect that. So, John, a lot of posturing here in Florida over the next couple of days, and at this point, the people of Florida still don't know who their next senator and next governor will be.
Hang in there, Ryan. Do the math. Don't listen to the spin. We'll be in touch throughout the next few days. With me in studio to share their reporting and their insights, Eliana Johnson with Politico, Carl Holst with the New York Times, Tarini Parti with BuzzFeed, and Margaret Talev with Bloomberg. Let's just start with the president. The state law says recount. The state law says recount. The president of the United States says forget the law?
Yeah,
great.
He's off base with that, obviously. And elections aren't held the way they're used to be held. It's not all election night anymore. He says, let's go back to election night. Well, that would be really unfair going back to election night because ballots were still continuing to come in. It's really unfortunate, I think, one, that Florida still has these problems in its ballot counting. It's a huge state. A lot of people voted this time, but they still should be able to get this under control. But for, these accusations of fixed elections and trying to steal the vote, it just undermines people's credibility further in our electoral process and really probably doesn't need to be done. As Ryan was saying, this is a big difference. The Republicans are probably going to still win these races, and they're sort of tarnishing themselves and the process.
Yeah, that's what was almost humorous to me about the president jumping in on this, even from a purely self-interested perspective. If there was a real fear that Democrats were to pull ahead here, it seems very unlikely. Republicans are ahead in these races. Democrats are unlikely to prevail in a recount. There's no need for the president to engage in this sort of rhetoric or behavior here, which makes it truly puzzling as to why he's coming in and making these sort of allegations. They only serve to hurt the Republican candidates who, when we go through this recount, are likely to prevail. Ron DeSantis in the governor's race and Rick Scott in the Senate race.
And to again undermine, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, a Trump supporter or a Trump critic, the President of the United States is constantly undermining trust and faith in institutions.
It is kind of the inverse of what you would expect from a traditional president who would say, I know emotions are very hot right now. We need to let the process play out. If there are improprieties, those will be discovered and we'll deal with them in due course. But to Leon's point, it raises another question, Trump aside, which is, it seems like they could take the high road. Is there some legal reason why they're not taking the high road? Is there some procedural reason why they want to get on the record expressing concerns about whatever in case they need that card to pull later in court? Again, all that seems like contingency work, though, because by all accounts, this is heading to where everyone thinks it's heading, regardless.
I think another point that makes the president's comments odd is that he likes to talk about the military and everything he's done to strengthen the military. And, military officials overseas right now, their ballots won't be counted until this week. So when he talks about only Election Day ballots being counted, that would just disenfranchise that whole section of voters he likes to talk about. So there's a clear contradiction in his own messaging as well.
Think before you tweet. Think before you tweet is part of it. And so the Democrats, even Andrew Gillum, on election night, Andrew Gillum, the Democratic candidate for governor, conceded. And then he saw the margins did get a little bit closer, and then the recount started, and then he faced pressure from progressive groups saying, hey, wait a minute, let's have a recount, and then he came within the law, so the law calls for it anyway. But listen to Andrew Gillum, who still says, I'm probably going to lose here. But he listens to the complaints about, is there fraud, is there crooked activity from the Republicans, and he says, what's going on here?
If you wonder why the President of the United States, the junior senator of the United States, Mr. Rubio, the sitting governor of the state of Florida are fighting like you know what to stop a vote count, that ought to tell you something.
Now it sounds almost like he is sliding toward the, as opposed to let's just count every vote. I'm probably still going to lose, but let's finish the process. That's the way it should work. Now it sounds like he's sliding toward adding suspicion.
There, right?
Yeah.
Well, look, not everything has been kosher in Florida. The Broward County election commissioner at one point was refusing to say how many ballots were left to count. That is not by the books. And so, Gillum is not right there, and there is a case to be made that not everything has gone according to the law in Florida. And this woman in Broward County has been censured before. But the fact that or the idea that not all the votes will be counted or have been counted or that there's a broader problem is incorrect.
Right. There's a compelling case for incompetence, and some would say even arrogance in Broward County in particular. Nobody, and again, Rick Scott's state police says they've seen no evidence, no credible allegation of cheating. And that's the key test here. This is my favorite moment of this discussion. Listen here. The President of the United States should listen here. This is Katherine Harris. She was the Secretary of State of Florida back in 2000. She became a pretty polarizing national figure. Democrats didn't like her then. Listen to Katherine Harris now, telling the President and all of us, calm down.
This isn't a constitutional crisis. It's a close race. I didn't know another recount would make me look good. So it's unfortunate, but Florida has an electorate that is very close in numbers, and consequently the same counties are in the same spot again. We have laws that will address that. It just is a matter of the elected officials administering those laws honorably and correctly.
I know a polarizing figure, but there's a voice of reason in the middle of this, and someone who speaks from experience. And maybe she realizes she might have done things a little bit differently, but she's just telling everybody, just let them count. Everybody calm down. What's wrong with that?
Right, and I think, I don't know that I've ever said this before. Catherine Harris was right when she said that. But I think it's also, but you're also seeing this in Arizona, where by all accounts, the counting was going appropriately, and the Democratic candidate percent is probably going to win. So this is a new strategy, I think, that's sort of alarming, that if something's going on in the election, you need to finish up the balloting. It gets confusing that everybody just starts to say, hey, it's fraud, they're stealing the election. That's a really, really bad trend, and hopefully we can get past this before 2020.
To your point, contrast it. A lot of national Republicans have been yelling at Arizona Republicans saying, start screaming. And the governor out there, and even the Senate candidate out there, who the Republican Senate candidate has gone from leading on election night to now trailing, they're saying this is how it goes. This is how they count votes. Let's see what happens. We'll talk to us when it's done. A very different process. I just want to make to the point Ryan Noble's made. This is why I wonder, why are the Republicans screaming so loudly? Why are they suing in so many places? Recount reality here. Look at this. 2000 to 2015 data on statewide recounts. We haven't had one in Florida since 2000. But the average margin, 282 votes. The largest margin overturned, or flipped, if you will, 2,200 votes. Now, Florida's bigger than Washington State. That's Washington State. But 2,200 votes. It's inconceivable, Democrats and Republicans who have done this, that 12,000 plus votes are going to flip in a recount, which is why they ask, why are Republicans screaming fraud and suing? Why don't they just say, we're going to watch, we're going to make sure we have observers in the room, no tricks, but let's finish.
Well, they are worried about this undercount, and the Democrats in Broward County, I think the Democrats want to get to a hand recount, where they can then get a look at some of these ballots and see if they were marked. And that's probably their hope. A machine recount is not going to make up these kind of...
But we spent all these months talking about the 400-pound guy in the basement and election hacking, and it turns out that in this race, the much more real concern is human error in the same states that always come into play. And it is... I guess if you were putting a silver lining on it, it's a good reminder before we head into 2020 that every vote counts, that some of these systems still need work, and that a voice of reason from leadership is probably better than everyone screaming fraud.
And maybe when Florida gets a new governor in January, instead of not doing anything about Broward County for 8 years and then complaining about it when you're on the Senate ballot, maybe the next governor, Democrat or Republican, will actually deal with them. And if they need to be sanctioned or called out in public, change their behavior, maybe they'll actually worry about elections before the election instead of after the election. Up next, we go to the California wildfires, where one official worries that with more than 200 people missing, January. One Democrat says, yes, celebration, but maybe also time to worry.
Am I worried? Yeah, I'm always worried. I'm a Democrat. I mean, we're proverbial bedwetters, so yes, I'm afraid of overreach.
Welcome back. 1 week after the midterm election, Democrats unveiling an ever-growing list of priorities for the upcoming Congress. Incoming committee chairs detailing their plans for investigations, subpoenas into everything from Robert Mueller's Russia probe to the president's campaign finance practices. President Trump tweeting today that this amounts, in his view, to presidential harassment. The president suggests, no evidence for this, that it's tanking the markets. But listen to Congresswoman Nita Lowey here on Axios on HBO, who says, with a little bit of spirit, the view's nice up here.
The funnest thing is to win. And we have our boxing gloves on, and we're going to fight for our priorities.
You're ready to rumble.
I'm ready. And so is Nancy.
Always good to hear Mike Allen say ready to rumble. There are still nearly 2 months to go before the Democrats take back control of the House. Now, that's a long time, especially in the age of President Trump. Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell telling the New York Times, Democrats better be careful and prioritize. Quote, the message is really don't chase every ball that he throws. We have to show the American people that there's a purpose behind everything that we do, and it's just not just to get a pound of flesh. That's hard, to that point, to tell Democrats after this election to calm down and to prioritize. But to the point that 2 months is a lot of time. Are the Democrats, do they have somebody saying, don't rush out and promise now, because we're not really quite sure what the terrain's going to look like in January?
I think the concern of overreach is something that a lot of Democrats are talking about, but at the same time, the president has given Democrats a clear way in by firing Jeff Sessions. I think that in talking about that, they can clearly go in with various different avenues in terms of protecting Mueller, especially with the president also appointing Whitaker as acting AG. That leads to a lot of questions. So he's sort of given, this opportunity where Democrats could have gone wrong and made some potential mistakes. He's instead given them a clear opening into investigating him even more.
It is almost not even the firing of Mueller as much as his replacement at this point, I think. But what's interesting to me is that you've seen some really early messaging of late in the public forum of Democrats who you might have thought of as left of center before, trying to message the voice of reason to the incoming class without doing it behind the scenes in a meeting. So they're doing it in the New York Times or on TV appearances. But it's not just Nancy Pelosi saying, put the brakes on the impeachment talk. It's Jerry Nadler, it's Eric Swalwell,
I think that's true about Sessions, but I question whether Whitaker will even be the Attorney General 2 months from now, which is an open question. And I think Swalwell's statement is interesting because Donald Trump is somebody who presents so many ripe targets for Democrats that there is a temptation to go after everything. And I think we saw in last week's press conference where Donald Trump went on for 90 minutes and essentially overshadowed what was Nancy Pelosi's first press conference, that it's going to be difficult for these investigations to break through. And I do think that it's going to be difficult for Democrats not only to prioritize, but then to make sure that the targets of their investigations really break through in the media coverage. Trump presents a challenge.
But you better be right. You better be right. You better be right. You better be right. And then you have to sell it. To that point, though, this is part of the challenge for Democrats. They know what they're against as President Trump. But what are they for? And there are differences within the party on that. And so this is a letter Nancy Pelosi just sent to her Democratic colleagues because the Democrats don't take power until January. But there is a lame duck session of Congress that begins pretty quickly here in Washington. A lot of big questions about spending. Will the president get his border wall? Can you cut a deal now? I don't think so, but could you put an immigration deal like DACA in exchange for the border wall on the table? Nancy Pelosi writes this in this new letter. As we travel to Washington for this lame duck period, House Democrats are anything but lame ducks. We have great opportunity and therefore great responsibility to get results for the American people. In the next few weeks, we need to be unified, find common ground with Republicans in our legislative engagements, but stand our ground when we must. She's trying to make a point that there's a period to make a down payment on the what we're for part. Can they?
Well, I think that they've got some leverage coming in, and it's a good question of what all the lame duck Republicans, the ones defeated, leaving, where they want to be on this. Do they want to help Trump out on the border wall, or do they want to make some last statement? And I think this kind of goes to the heart of the problem for the Democrats. To me, it's not so much, are they going to over-investigate? There are a lot of targets. They're going to have to staff up and get it. But can they legislate at the same time? Can they do both things? And to me, that's a question. These people haven't been in power for a while. The staff's not there. Some of these people have never run committees before. And they need to produce quickly some real legislation and not just get caught up in the investigation.
But that's part of Pelosi's reason for her arguing, you need me in charge. I've done this before. I can stand up to the president. Some of you need some experience. Listen to Kevin McCarthy here, who wants to be the House Republican leader. Paul Ryan is leaving. They have to have an election. Kevin McCarthy is being opposed by Jim Jordan. Listen to him right here saying, the Democrats don't seem like they want much.
I look at what the Democrats' agenda is. What is it? It's investigating the president, trying to impeach him, abolishing ICE. America is too great to be led by such a small vision.
Now, Democrats would counter. Republicans passed a tax cut. What else did you do for your last 2 years in power, maybe? But to that point, that is part of the challenge for the Democrats. You do have progressive Democrats coming in who did say abolish ICE, who are saying impeach the president, and they have to try to manage that, and it's clear the Republicans are going to try to poke it whenever they can.
Yeah, I think the challenge for Democrats in terms of legislating and talking about a positive vision is that they have so many legislators in both the House and the Senate who are looking at 2020 candidacies, and they have to view cooperating with the Trump administration through the prism of that and whether it behooves them to cooperate with the president or to resist him at every turn.
And the challenge for Kevin McCarthy is to show that he's, Republican enough compared to Jim Jordan to satisfy that portion of the caucus. It's a different job in the minority than it was in the majority, but nonetheless, both parties are dealing with this split between the people who think they can harness the dissatisfied middle and the people who think the only way to win this is to energize the people who are out for a pound. You know?
A lot of difficulties for Democrats, but they're pretty happy that they're going to be in charge.
Yeah, they're in charge as they deal with their difficulties now, as opposed to being in the minority when they do. When we come back, a pollster who worked for the Clintons for a long time says get ready for Hillary Clinton to run again. Really? Topping our political radar today, an update on the Arizona Senate race. Democratic Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema currently has a 32,000 vote lead over her Republican competition, Congresswoman Martha McSally. About 90% of the votes have now been counted in Arizona. And ready for Clinton 2020? Former Clinton strategist Mark Penn says Hillary Clinton will run for president again. Penn, writing in a Wall Street Journal editorial, said, quote, Hillary 4.0 will give it another shot and, quote, won't let a little thing like 2 stunning defeats stand in the way for a claim to the White House. Penn, this morning on Fox News, said the conditions, however, have to be right.
If she does go, it will be because no one emerges as a clear front runner. Right. It looks like the party is splintered in lots of different ways, and she can come in, re-energize the core of the Democratic base, take the nomination, and have the biggest rematch in history with probably the biggest voter turnout in history based on that.
What do you think?
Well,
no? Yes?
There'll be quite a crowd running for president, I think, on the Democratic side, so it won't be a slam dunk.
The written word, a lot less favorable than the spoken word there, and to me that's the hard part. It used to be in this town, if you worked for somebody in a campaign, even if you had a falling out, as they did, that you just kept that to yourself. We live in a new age. We'll just leave it at that as we watch for these things. Before we go to break, a special thank you to all the veterans who have served this country. And we want to share this from Iraq War veteran Tammy Duckworth. She's a Democrat, a senator now from Illinois. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, listen to this. She tweets, today is my alive day, the anniversary of the day I almost died but didn't. On this day 14 years ago, an RPG tore through the cockpit of the helicopter. I was flying over Iraq, taking my legs and partial use of my right arm with it. I was quite literally in pieces, but my buddies risked their lives and refused to leave me behind. Our thanks to her buddies. And thank you, Senator Duckworth, for your service. Today, tweeting his own review of his quick weekend trip to France, bragging he got a lot done on a visit many others saw as a disappointment, or worse. Here's the tweet, just returned from France, where much was accomplished in my meetings with world leaders. He went on to say, never easy bringing up the fact that the United States must be treated fairly, which it hasn't, on both military and trade. This situation cannot continue, the president says. It is time that these very rich countries either pay the United States for its great military protection or protect themselves, and trade must be made free and fair. That list of grievances, hardly new for the president. European diplomats say if no or not much progress was made on this trip, in their view, it was because President Trump was detached and disinterested. One global expert put it this way.
It's kind of like, that's a nice continent you've got there. Be a shame if something were to happen to it. But we also know that Trump has given that message before at the NATO summit, at the G7 summit, at the G20 summit.
This was it was a quick trip. It was meant to honor World War I, the 100th anniversary of the Allied victory in World War I. The president got criticized for not going to one cemetery event he was supposed to go to. But it was just a weird trip. A weird trip. His friendship with Macron has clearly gone downhill. What do we make of it? Is it so what, or is there something transactional here?
Well, I think it showed that the one-time allies are no longer so closely tied anymore, and Trump is really at the vanguard of sort of new nationalist forces that are remaking the European continent, from Viktor Orban in Hungary to happening in Italy and elsewhere, and that everybody from Trump himself to Emmanuel Macron in France are grappling with it. And so there aren't any sort of clear takeaways. I think it will remain to be seen what happens post-Trump and after some of these new nationalist leaders leave the scene in Europe, but clearly we're sort of at a tipping point, both in the U.S. and in Europe.
And to that point, a lot of the European leaders think that these European forces, which pre-exist, most of them were there before President Trump, but they believe that they are encouraged, inspired, and gaining energy because of the example of President Trump. So you had the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, who, remember, had dinner with the president at the Eiffel Tower, had a parade for him the president loved. Their body language in their previous meetings has been great. It was much more chilly, the body language this time. And then from the president of France, with the United States president right there, this.
Contraire du nationalisme.
Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism by saying, our interests first, who cares about the others?
You get the sense that the first few meetings, they didn't like a lot of things the president had said. They didn't like his tone on Twitter. They were trying to figure out, but can we work with him? Is he a different person in private? Does he have to do that for his domestic political audience, but we can work some business? They seem to have given up on that.
Well, certainly that was a rebuke to President Trump, but it was a rebuke to President Trump with a continental purpose, which is to remind not just the leaders who were weakened in places like Germany, England, but to remind the voters, the constituents of Europe, to remember the lessons of World War I and also World War II, and to say, do you want to be more like what President Trump is selling, or do you want to remember the lessons of World War I? So that's Macron's purpose. Where does this all go, though? And I think that's the question. You've got the European trade negotiator heading to the U.S. for a week, in which Trump wants them in a weakened position, and you've got Macron standing lowered, Merkel standing lowered. These summits or gatherings like this can sometimes, at their best, be used to leverage everyone's common beliefs. Those common beliefs and those alliances are frayed right now, and I think the message coming out of this is that those forces that talk about alliances and NATO and unity and kind of democratic values are weakened and are divided right now.
I think the direct rebuke of the president also felt a little jarring for two reasons. One, that's usually the president's job. President Trump, when he's done these trips, he's the one sort of making these comments in front of world leaders that really gets the attention. And secondly, we saw the president all week last week really become this combative person post-election. He took a victory lap and then immediately had the executive action. He took away Jim Acosta's press credentials. So we saw him take a lot of action, and then during this trip really take a back seat and let the other world leaders take the front stage.
And he was criticized for not taking a drive when he couldn't helicopter to an American military cemetery. The White House saying it would take 2.5 hours each way. 2.5 hours each way. We can show you a map. It's about 50 miles outside of Paris. If the president wanted to go, he could have gone a little more than an hour. Not 2.5 hours each way. I'll leave that for people at home to process.
I think a lot of these overseas events are about images for the public consumption. I think these were bad images for Trump. He went over there. This was supposed to be the substitute for his parade here. World War I, the 100th anniversary, this is a big, big moment. And I think the image people are going to take away from this was the president being scolded for being a nationalist.
And the mood issue. But we'll see where we go from here. Up next, Beto O'Rourke says he's here to help the country, whatever way he can. Some Democrats say, head to Iowa, run for president. Welcome back. Beto wants you to know it was pancakes and bacon and eggs to start the day at the O'Rourke house, and then a little movie night to end it. Oh, and yes, it was a, quote, bitter loss to Ted Cruz, but also, he says, a remarkable journey for which he is grateful. O'Rourke, of course, was the Democratic Senate candidate in Texas who became a national celebrity to progressives. In his long note to supporters over the weekend, he said he's looking forward to a little downtime and a little dad time. And for those hoping he keeps running, as into Iowa and in 2020, quote, just know that I want to be part of the best way forward for this country, whatever way I can help in whatever form that takes. O'Rourke writes, know that I am honored to have run in this campaign with you and that I want to continue to honor and to be honest to what was powerful about it. The signature, quote, see you down the road. Beto. And what road?
Yeah.
What road?
I mean, how does he resist, right? There's so many people urging him. He ran a great race in a tough state. He's super popular, super high name recognition right now. I think that he's going to be drawn into it, as are a lot of people. Conventional wisdom says that running from a losing race is not the best way to really launch your presidential campaign. But what's he got
cares
to,
about conventional wisdom?
what's he got to lose? What's he got to lose?
That conventional wisdom says Donald Trump could never win the Republican nomination and never win the presidency. To that point, listen to this. This is from CNN.com. This is Jeff Rowe, who's Ted Cruz's chief strategist. And this is a compliment. Ted Cruz just beat Beto O'Rourke. Cruz chief strategist Jeff Rowe said Democrats, quote, don't have anyone of his caliber on the national stage. I pray for the soul of anyone who has to run against him in Iowa. He used a fog machine at his concession speech. he ain't done.
Barack Obama was always pretending to eat carbs also, and then you'd be on the plane and you'd be eating like almonds and microgreens. Like, Beto is doing what anybody in Beto's position would be doing. And to that point, I think when Jeff Rowe saw what for a long time looked like a 9 or 10 point cushion and watched what Beto O'Rourke was doing, he concluded what any pollster would conclude, which is this guy is preparing a 2020.
Now, there are people saying stay in Texas. John Cornyn's up in 2020. Stay in Texas, keep that organization up and running, stay in touch with those people, run there. Is that too small?
I think that, based on everything we've heard about with Beto, he probably wants more. And I think Jeff Rowe's comment there was perhaps a little bit of a troll as well, because we're seeing Republicans also push his name more and more because they feel like, with this sort of progressive person, they can win, the middle of America again and have that same 2016 argument that'll help them in 2020. And
so he's puts out a long note. He's having pancakes. It's movie night. What do you do at this moment when you were a national sensation, you lost, and that hurts. That hurts. So you're thinking, could I have won?